On a cold afternoon in April 1945, a woman sat in the sitting room of the White House and received a phone call that changed the world. But for her, it was simply the final chapter of a long, exhausting story. She had lived there for 12 years, longer than any woman before or since. She had redefined the very geography of the building, turning it from a social fortress into a headquarters for the forgotten. She had flown to Pacific war zones, walked into coal mines, and faced down death threats. And now, the man who had been the center of her gravity was gone. Eleanor Roosevelt survived a lonely childhood, a broken heart, and 3 decades of the most intense political scrutiny in history, only to be remembered by many as a footnote to a great man. But her story starts far from the West Wing. It starts in a world of stifling New York high society that told her she wasn't enough. Her name at birth was Anna Eleanor Roosevelt. She was born on October 11, 1884, into the American aristocracy, a world of mahogany libraries and summer estates that looked perfect from the outside and felt like a cage from the within. Her mother, Anna Hall, was a celebrated beauty who found her daughter's plainness a personal disappointment. She called Eleanor Granny to her face, a nickname meant to highlight the child's solemn, unsmiling nature. It was the kind of childhood that taught a girl to apologize for taking up space. Her father, Elliot, the brother of future President Teddy Roosevelt, was the only one who showed her warmth, calling her his Little Nell. But he was a man losing a battle with alcoholism and morphine. By the time Eleanor was 10, both her parents were dead. She was sent to live with a strict, joyless grandmother in a house where the heat was rarely turned on and the rules were never broken. She grew up wearing dresses that were too short and shoes that were too heavy, a girl who believed she was an ugly duckling in a family of swans. She would later say that she never knew what it meant to feel loved as a child, and she said it with a matter-of-factness that was more heartbreaking than any tears. But what she did next tells you everything about the steel in her spine. She didn't let the loneliness break her, she let it sharpen her. At 15, she was sent to Allenswood, a finishing school in England, where a headmistress named Marie Sylvester saw past the shy exterior. She taught Eleanor that a woman's worth wasn't in her face, but in her utility to the world. Eleanor returned to New York not as a debutante looking for a husband, but as a teacher in the slums of the Lower East Side. She was 20 years old, and she had already decided that a life lived only for oneself was no life at all. In 1905, Eleanor Roosevelt married her distant cousin, a charismatic and ambitious Harvard graduate named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was everything she was not: comfortable in his skin, easy with a laugh, and convinced of his own destiny. Their wedding was a major social event, presided over by Eleanor's uncle, President Teddy Roosevelt, who famously stole the spotlight from the bride. For the next decade, Eleanor played the role she had been trained for: the supportive political wife, the mother of 5 children, and the dutiful daughter-in-law to Franklin's formidable mother, Sarah. But beneath the surface of the perfect political couple, the foundation was cracking. Eleanor was living in houses she didn't own, raising children under her mother-in-law's direction, and feeling, in her own words, like a colorless reflection of other people's needs. The breaking point came in 1918. While unpacking Franklin's luggage after a trip, Eleanor discovered a packet of love letters. They were from Lucy Mercer, Eleanor's own social secretary. The betrayal was absolute. The woman who had spent her life believing she wasn't pretty enough to be loved now had the ultimate proof. She offered Franklin a divorce, a move that would have ended his political career in the early 20th century. Instead, they struck a bargain of necessity. They would stay together for the sake of the children and his ambitions, but the romantic marriage was over. It was replaced by a political partnership that would change the course of American history. Eleanor stopped trying to be the woman Franklin wanted and started becoming the woman she needed to be. Then, in August 1921, the world they had built together collapsed. While vacationing at Campobello, Franklin was struck by a mysterious fever that left him paralyzed from the waist down. It was polio. At 39 years old, the man who lived for motion was suddenly still. His mother, Sarah, wanted him to retire to the family estate at Hyde Park and live the life of a quiet invalid. Eleanor disagreed. She knew that if Franklin gave up on his public life, he would wither away. Against the wishes of the most powerful woman in the family, Eleanor became the engine of his recovery. She didn't just nurse him, she became his eyes and ears. She began traveling to political meetings he couldn't attend, learning to speak in public despite a paralyzing shyness, and reporting back on the state of the Democratic Party. She was no longer just a wife, she was a scout. By 1928, when Franklin ran for governor of New York, Eleanor had built her own network of activists, labor leaders, and reformers. She was the one who told him what the people in the tenements were saying. She was the one who pushed him to look past the statistics and see the human beings behind them. They were a team now, bound not by a traditional romance, but by a shared sense of work. She had learned, through the pain of betrayal and the grueling years of his illness, that she could stand on her own. She had built a life that was entirely hers, with her own friends and her own causes. But as 1932 approached, a much larger stage was waiting for her, a stage she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to walk onto. On March 4, 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt stood on the inaugural platform and watched her husband take the oath of office as the 32nd President of the United States. The country was paralyzed by the Great Depression, with millions out of work and breadlines stretching around city blocks. Eleanor was 48 years old, and she was terrified. She told a friend that she didn't want to be First Lady. She feared the ornamental nature of the role would act as a prison for the independent life she had spent a decade building. She had spent years as a teacher, an editor, and an activist, and now she was expected to be a hostess. But Eleanor did what she had always done when faced with a cage. She broke the lock. She transformed the White House from a social museum into a nerve center for social change. Within 48 hours of moving in, she held the first-ever press conference for women journalists only, a move that forced news organizations to hire women if they wanted access to the First Lady. It wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was a practical creation of jobs. She began writing a daily newspaper column titled, My Day, a diary of her travels and thoughts that ran 6 days a week for nearly 30 years. She used it to bypass the traditional filters of the press, speaking directly to the American people about everything from the price of milk to the necessity of racial justice. She was no longer just the president's wife, she was the nation's most visible advocate. While Franklin dealt with the macroeconomics of the New Deal, Eleanor dealt with the human cost. She traveled 40,000 miles in her first year alone, earning the Secret Service code name, Rover. She went where the president's wheelchair could not. She went down into the dark, damp shafts of coal mines in West Virginia to talk to miners about their lungs and their wages. She visited the Hoovervilles, the shanty towns of the homeless, and sat on their dirt floors. She became the conscience of the administration, often waking Franklin up at night to tell him about a family she had met or a school that was falling apart. He would sometimes sigh and say, "Eleanor, I can't do everything at once," but she never stopped asking. Her signature initiative was the plight of the forgotten man, but she increasingly focused on the forgotten woman and the forgotten race. In 1935, she began pushing for anti-lynching legislation, a position so radical for a first lady that it put her at odds with her husband's Southern political base. She didn't care about the polls. She had spent 30 years being told who she was supposed to be, and she was done with performance. She was sharp, she was tireless, and she was genuinely interested in the mechanics of suffering. And then, as the 1930s drew to a close, a new and darker challenge began to rise across the ocean, a challenge that would test the very limits of her endurance. By 1939, the world was sliding toward a catastrophe that no one could fully grasp, and Eleanor Roosevelt found herself standing in the center of a different kind of storm. While Franklin navigated the high-stakes diplomacy of a world on the brink of war, Eleanor was fighting a battle for the soul of the country at home. In February of that year, the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow the world-renowned black contralto Marian Anderson to perform in Constitution Hall because of the color of her skin. The insult was public, and the silence from the White House was expected to be total. But Eleanor didn't do silence. She resigned her membership in the DAR and helped arrange for Anderson to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday. 75,000 people stood in the cold to hear her, and millions more listened on the radio. It was the first time a First Lady had used her platform to challenge the very foundations of American segregation, and she did it without asking for permission. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the long campaign of the New Deal shifted into the brutal reality of total war. Eleanor didn't retreat into the safety of the White House. She did what she had always done. She went to the people. In 1943, she flew to the South Pacific, traveling 25,000 miles in a cramped military transport plane to visit American troops. She didn't just stand on a podium and wave, she walked through hospital wards for hours on end, sitting on the edge of beds, taking down the names and addresses of wounded boys so she could write personal letters to their mothers when she got back. Admiral William Halsey, who had initially been skeptical of a politician's wife visiting a combat zone, later said that she did more for the morale of his men than any other single person who had visited the theater. She was effective at it, genuinely, measurably effective, in the way that military commanders noticed and tried to replicate. But she also hated the process of it. The constant flashbulbs, the management of her image, the feeling of being a symbol rather than a human being. She had once told a reporter that she never had time to think about who she wanted to be, she had only ever worked. There had been no dreaming, only the next task, the next letter, the next hospital ward. Politics and war had extended that condition rather than changing it. It was more work, longer hours in public, with the added weight of an entire nation's projections about who she was supposed to be. Then, on April 12, 1945, the machinery stopped. Franklin died of a cerebral hemorrhage in Warm Springs, Georgia. Eleanor reportedly took the news with a quiet steadiness that some mistook for coldness, but those who knew her understood it was the composure of someone who had been holding a line for 25 years. She had spent a lifetime in service of his ambitions, his health, and his presidency. Now, as she packed her bags to leave the White House, she told the press, "The story is over." She thought she was going home to New York to finally have a life that belonged only to her. She was 60 years old, and she thought her work was done. She couldn't have been more wrong. The years after the White House were not a retirement, they were a liberation. Harry Truman, the man who had succeeded her husband, called her the First Lady of the World, and then he gave her a job that no one else wanted. In December 1945, he appointed her as a delegate to the newly formed United Nations. The world was broken, divided by the burgeoning Cold War, and haunted by the horrors of the Holocaust. Eleanor was 61 years old. She had spent 30 years saying things in public that were useful to her husband's purposes, and she was finally done with that. She was there to speak for herself. For 2 years, she chaired the UN Commission on Human Rights. It was exacting, detail-heavy work, and she was masterly at it. She navigated the demands of the Soviets, the French, and the British with the same quiet steadiness she had used to navigate her own mother-in-law. She stayed up late into the night, drafting and redrafting what would become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When it passed in 1948, it was the first time in human history that a global document had asserted that every human being, regardless of race, creed, or gender, had inherent dignity. She called it her most important work, and she was right. It was the only victory that was entirely her own. She never returned to the social or political visibility of the White House, but she never truly stopped working. She moved to a modest cottage called Val Kill in Hyde Park, New York, where she gardened, wrote, and hosted world leaders under the trees. The grandchildren were, by all accounts, the most uncomplicated source of happiness in her life. With them, the woman who had been a composed, managed presence for decades finally let the mask slip. She was simply there, and she was glad to be. In 1960, she was diagnosed with aplastic anemia and later tuberculosis. She had been a private sufferer of respiratory issues for years, something she had hidden from the public because she never wanted to be seen as weak. Eleanor Roosevelt died at home in New York City on November 7, 1962. She was 78 years old. At her funeral, the world leaders she had challenged and the ordinary people she had championed stood side by side in the rain. Adlai Stevenson, the UN ambassador, gave a eulogy that has stayed in the historical record. He said she would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and that her glow had warmed the world. She is buried in the Rose Garden at Hyde Park, side by side with Franklin, in a place that had once felt like a prison but eventually became a monument. What she left, the things Eleanor Roosevelt actually did, are not difficult to find. They have always been there, though they were long overshadowed by the giant shadow of the man she married. She was the first lady to walk into a combat zone, the first to hold a press conference, the first to earn her own salary, and the first to tell the American people that civil rights weren't a political choice, but a moral necessity. She raised 5 children who remembered her not with the obligatory warmth of family, but with the specific, detail-filled love of people who knew she had fought for every inch of her own identity. She was born an orphan who felt like a ghost in her own home and died a woman whose name was synonymous with the conscience of humanity. She said she would never be as famous as her husband, but the record is there, and it says what she actually was. And none of it required a presidency to be real.